Mercedes is about to face its biggest problem of the season. Because Red Bull didn't just complain. They revealed new evidence that explains exactly how Mercedes has been gaining up to 40 extra horsepower, while still passing every FIA test as completely legal. And if that sounds insane, it gets worse. This isn't happening all the time. It only appears when the engine reaches real race conditions. Which means Mercedes isn't just faster. They're faster exactly when the race is decided. And here's the part that changes everything. The FIA already investigated this. Already measured it. Already approved it. So how do you stop a system that dominates the sport, but technically doesn't break the rules? Red Bull says they've finally exposed the answer. And if they're right, then everything we've watched this season was never a fair fight. Subscribe now, because what Red Bull just revealed puts Mercedes in serious trouble. Red Bull didn't reveal this overnight. They couldn't. Because what they were dealing with wasn't obvious. It wasn't something you see in a single lap. Or even a single race. It was something that only appears when you connect everything together. And that's exactly what they did. Because at first, nothing looked illegal. That's the key detail. The Mercedes engine passed every FIA test. Every inspection. Every verification. 16:1 compression. Exactly the limit. Exactly what the rules allow. But on track, it told a completely different story. And Red Bull felt it before they understood it. Because drivers don't need data to know when something is off. They feel it in the car. The way it accelerates. The way it keeps pulling. The way it doesn't fade when it should. And every time they followed a Mercedes on a straight, the same thing happened. At first, it looked normal. The gap stayed stable. Manageable. And then, something changed. The Mercedes just kept accelerating. Longer. Stronger. As if it had something extra. And that's when Red Bull stopped asking how fast Mercedes was. And started asking when they become fast. Because that's where hidden performance lives. Not in peak numbers. In timing. In transitions. In the exact moment where something changes. So they went deeper. Much deeper. They broke everything down into phases. Corner exit. Mid-straight. Energy deployment. Tiny windows where performance differences become visible. And that's where the first real pattern appeared. Because the Mercedes engine wasn't constant. It wasn't delivering fixed performance. It was evolving. Lap after lap. Heat after heat. And that's when the connection became impossible to ignore. Because performance increased with temperature. Not randomly. Predictably. And that leads to one thing. Thermal behavior. Because in Formula 1, materials expand under heat. That's basic physics. But what Mercedes did was turn that physics into an advantage. Because the engine is designed to be perfectly legal when it's cold. 16:1. Measured. Verified. Approved. But under real race conditions, everything changes. The temperature rises. The materials expand. The internal geometry shifts. And the combustion chamber becomes smaller. Which means one thing. Compression increases. Closer to 18:1. Exactly where the extra power comes from. And that difference is massive. Because every step in compression adds real performance. 15 to 20 horsepower per point. Which means Mercedes is gaining up to 40 horsepower. Without breaking the written rules. And now everything makes sense. The straight line advantage. The late race dominance. The ability to pull away when others can't respond. But here's where this becomes a real problem. Because before this moment, Everything could be denied. Everything could be explained away. Now, it can't. Because Red Bull didn't just suggest it. They mapped it. They showed how it works, when it works, and why it works. And that transforms this from a theory into something much more dangerous. Because once the entire paddock understands the advantage, the pressure becomes unavoidable. Not just on Mercedes, but on the FIA. Because now the question is no longer, is it happening? The question is, why is it still allowed? And this is where everything Red Bull revealed stops being just a technical debate and becomes a real problem for Formula One itself. Because once you understand how this engine works, you start to understand what it's really doing. It's not just creating more power. It's controlling when that power exists. And that changes everything. Because Red Bull went back again. Not to the numbers. Not to the data sheets. To the races themselves. To the exact moments where races are decided. And what they found is what makes this impossible to ignore. Mercedes doesn't dominate from the start. They don't need to. They stay close. They manage. They wait. And then, when the race reaches its critical phase, everything changes. The car becomes sharper, more aggressive, more responsive on exit. And suddenly, the gap appears. Fast, clean, final. And once it appears, it never comes back. That's not just speed. That's control over the outcome. And that's what Red Bull couldn't replicate. Because their version of the same concept didn't behave like that. It produced gains, but not at the same moment. Not with the same precision. Not with the same consistency. And that's the difference between having an idea and mastering it. But here's where the story becomes even more uncomfortable. Because once Red Bull understood timing, they looked at something deeper. Something that explains why Mercedes doesn't just gain once. They keep gaining energy. Because more compression doesn't just give you power. It gives you efficiency. And efficiency gives you something even more valuable. Control over energy flow. Because data from the first races shows something that cannot be ignored. Mercedes is harvesting more energy per lap. More than Ferrari. More than Red Bull. And that means one thing. The advantage doesn't stop at combustion. It continues through the entire system. Because more efficient combustion creates more usable energy. That energy feeds the hybrid system, the MGUK. And that system delivers power exactly when the driver needs it most. Not randomly. Not constantly. Precisely. And that's where everything connects. Compression increases efficiency. Efficiency increases energy recovery. Energy recovery increases deployment. And deployment controls performance. This is not one advantage. It's a chain reaction. A fully integrated system where every gain amplifies the next. And that's what Red Bull has really exposed. Not a loophole. Not a trick. A complete performance architecture. Designed to stay invisible during inspection. And become dominant in real racing conditions. And that's why this is so difficult to stop. Because you can close a loophole. You can change a measurement. But you cannot instantly recreate a system that has been developed over years. And that leads to the moment that now defines everything. June. Because that's when the rules finally catch up. When engines must behave the same. Cold and hot. When the FIA measures the engine at real operating temperature. Around 130 degrees. And when that moment comes, there is nowhere left to hide. No more gaps. No more interpretation. only truth. If Mercedes loses performance, then everything Red Bull revealed is confirmed. But if they don't, if they remain just as dominant, then this story becomes something much bigger than anyone expected. Because that would mean the compression advantage was never the real secret, just the visible one. And that leads to the final, uncomfortable question. If Red Bull has already exposed how it works, why does it still feel like Mercedes is hiding something even deeper?